New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is psychiatry and the soul. My guest is Dr. Judy Suzanne, who is a Harvard adult and child psychiatrist with a private practice for over 30 years. She is board certified and thoroughly trained in the conventional allopathic approach to psychiatric care, but she no longer endorses it. In fact, she believes that it causes harm. She is the author of Sacred Psychiatry, bridging the personal and transpersonal to transform health and consciousness. Judy is based in the Boston area, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Judy. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. I'm honored to be here.
Well, it's very exciting to me to meet a psychiatrist who has made such a radical transition as you seem to have done. And as I read your book, I see that a very important turning point for you in your life occurred when you were 49 years old. And you related to what you call the Chiron return in astrology. But as I understand it, it marks a transition from a psychiatrist who is in practice for many, many years, practicing conventional allopathic medicine and psychiatry. And now you have written a book called Sacred Psychiatry, and you claim, if I understand it correctly, that the methods that you worked with for so many years before your transition, you now believe are actually harmful to people.
Well, I need to kind of correct that a bit. I was never entirely conventional because I was trained as a psychoanalyst, and my practice was psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, which is not that common for a psychiatrist. And so I was never one who was just prescribing a lot of medications to people, identifying symptoms and prescribing medications. And that is what I think is harmful, that to rely solely on pharmaceuticals. That's not the way my practice was, but when I was 49 and had a series of losses that resulted in me consulting as an astrologer for the first time, and then seeing her many times over the next couple of years because I was so amazed by what she had to say to me that I began to study astrology myself. And that was kind of the gateway to opening myself up to all kinds of different holistic approaches.
I see. I remember when I was, an undergraduate in psychology back in the 1960s, they did surveys of psychiatrists. And at that time, it was said that Freud was the dominant influence in the field of psychiatry. But I gather that subsequently, the pharmaceutical industry really took command of the psychiatric profession. And furthermore, the insurance companies loved it because it was quick and easy and less expensive for the insurance companies than paying for years of psychoanalysis.
100%. In the 50s, I think psychoanalysis was king, even into the 60s. And then little by little, pharmacology and the pharmaceutical industry began to have the largest influence on psychiatry and the way it was practiced.
I recall in your book a section in which you enumerate all the ways in which conventional medicine is really effective. And it struck me because I am now in the queue to get a knee replacement surgery, and I was gratified to see that you included knee replacements as something conventional medicine is good at.
Right. I mean, there's all kinds of sort of mechanical fixes and also like stabilization and life-saving measures if somebody is traumatically injured that Western medicine excels at. I mean, like cataract surgery and all kinds of really kind of amazing mechanical fixes and stabilization. But anything that has to do with a chronic condition, I think it really misses the boat in a big way.
Well, you refer to the time of life that you were at the age of 49. I guess that would be true for any person at the age of 49. They have what is known as the Chiron return. And even for people who are familiar with astrology or astronomy, Chiron is extremely obscure. It's an asteroid.
That's correct. That's correct. And I actually had the intention initially of titling my book Chironic Psychiatry. And my publisher said, that's not a good idea. People would think you misspelled chronic. You know what that was. Yeah. But Chiron is a fascinating body because I described this in my book that the orbit of Chiron goes between Saturn and Uranus. And Saturn is the last planet visible to the naked eye. It was the last planet that the ancients knew of who could only look at the sky with the naked eye. But Uranus was discovered in 1784 with the advent of the telescope, and it represents something that exists that can't be seen. So Chiron is kind of weaving between the known 3D reality and another reality that exists but is not apprehendable with our five senses. And Chiron mythologically was a centaur, so he was half horse and half man. And in some way, I believe mirrors human beings, and that we are physical bodies and we are animals and we are also spiritual beings. So we're also both. We're a hybrid.
I began researching Chiron a little bit after I read your book because I myself, astrologically speaking, my son was in Sagittarius when I was born. And Sagittarius is also like Chiron, a centaur, half horse and half man, but different because Chiron was known in the ancient world in mythology as a great healer, as a figure of enormous wisdom who had, if I recall correctly, some of the great sages of the past were considered students of Chiron.
Right. The kings would send their sons to him to be educated because he was such a great mentor. But he, as the myth goes, Hercules inadvertently wounded him in the thigh with a arrow dipped in the blood of the Hydra, and that caused a wound that could not be healed. And Chiron, despite all of his enormous skills and knowledge, was in kind of perpetual agony. He also couldn't die because he was half god and half mortal. I mean, his mother was a nymph. But then he, out of compassion and altruism, he exchanged places with Prometheus, who had been chained to a rock and was having his liver pecked out daily for having given fire to humankind. And then the gods were so moved by his act of service that they put him up in the sky as a constellation. But he sort of embodies the idea that there are certain wounds that we all carry that are, Ram Dass said that we become like a connoisseur of our neuroses, or that's what he advised. Like there's things that we just don't get over entirely.
Like a wound that will never heal.
Right, but that we process it differently, and that we learn to live with it in a way that it's not as dominating as it was at some point in our life, but it doesn't entirely go away. And also that we sort of save ourselves by acts of service to others.
Your own personal story is similar to that of Chiron. You write about, and you're very open about things that most psychiatrists, I don't think, would be willing to disclose. You write about being rejected by your mother.
Correct, just like Chiron was. She was very depressed. She was the only surviving member of her family in the Holocaust, and she was very depressed when she was pregnant with me, and said I was an ugly baby when I was born, and went on to be psychiatrically hospitalized 6 weeks later. So she had a postpartum depression and was very ill. And Chiron was also rejected by his mother. He was the product of a rape. Zeus impregnated his mother, Philyra, who was a nymph, by assuming the form of a stallion, and so that's how Chiron was like half horse and half human. But, those kind of shamanic beginnings, I think are very determining, and it can give us a lot of compassion and understanding and motivation to try to make sense of things and to heal others. So it's like life purpose, that gets seeded. I mean, or it was probably seeded before conception, but gets expressed that way.
Well, I gather that up until the age of 49, although you were a psychoanalyst, meaning you practiced depth psychiatry, looking into the unconscious mind, that the realm of mythos, the realm of astrology, for example, was less important to you. Somehow the Chiron return awakened something in you.
That's right. Like, conventional psychoanalysis is totally allergic to anything spiritual or mythic. It's much more about the personality and the experiences of the person in their early childhood and the impact of that. There's not any kind of connection with ideas of life purpose or that we come in with some kind of sacred template that we're invited to engage with over the course of our lifetime. I mean, that's completely foreign, that notion.
And that would be one of the premises of astrology, is that we have this template based on the position of the entire cosmos, really, around us at the moment of our birth.
That's correct. That's correct. It's been called like a sacred roadmap that gives you a lot of clues about, what path you could take in order, when you're in your deathbed, when you're looking back, that you would say, that was a life well lived, that you would somehow have fulfilled. And I mean, the archetypes there's so many different possible ways that they can be expressed that in my view, you can't look at a birth chart and say, oh, okay, this person is this way or that way. You need to talk with them and ask them about the ways in which they are embodying the archetype. And I mean, there's higher vibrational expressions of the archetype and shadow expressions. And most of us will, over the course of our lifetime, done all of them or many of them. But you can't tell just looking at a birth chart what a person is like. You can have some guesses. And like when I do a reading for someone, I'll say to them, I'm going to talk for like 10 or 15 minutes, just what I see. And then I want you to tell me, like, is this resonating? Because like let's say there's a relationship between the sun and Neptune in the chart. That could be like a father, could refer to a father who was very distant or checked out or addicted or in some kind of way absent or unavailable. Or it could be a father who was extremely spiritually attuned, but you don't know, by just looking at those symbols.
I am under the impression that one thing astrology can be useful for is the whole question of timing of events.
Yes, that's true. But like, let's say you have symbols in your chart of something that would be in a very auspicious time to do something. But if you don't take advantage of it and you don't do the work to take advantage of that cosmic wind in your sails, it will pass you by. Like, I don't believe in prediction myself. Like, that's not the kind of astrology that I practice. But it can be very helpful if you are working, like I sometimes use astrology in my practice with patients who are in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis with me, and like they're going through like a terrible time, and there's contact of Pluto with like a very vulnerable, personal, deep place in their chart. And I can say to them, like it's likely that, on such and such a date that this energy will be lessening and you won't be feeling the same way. So in that way, like sort of the astrological weather.
In fact, we did an interview not long ago with another person who, unbeknownst to me, was also an astrologer, but he began opening up, and he made a point of saying, with reference to Pluto, and you write about this in your book as well, the movement of Pluto, I think, happening right now, really from the sign of Capricorn, which is different than the the astronomical constellation of Capricorn. The signs and the constellations are no longer in alignment, but moved into the sign of Aquarius. Pluto has now made that transition. And so my friend said, all of the worries and trouble and darkness that has seemed to be upon us since about 2008 is now being lifted because of the movement of Pluto. How do you feel about that?
I don't agree with that. I think we don't know the way that Pluto in Aquarius is going to manifest. Like, it could manifest as kind of an enlightened society, or it could manifest as a very dystopian society, because the sign of Aquarius is very much linked with technology. I mean, when Pluto made that initial movement into Aquarius, that was like last spring, all of a sudden there was this explosion in the internet about ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, and it's going to move back into Capricorn again very briefly for a couple of months in November, I think September and October, November, and then it's going to move for the next 20 years in Aquarius. But I don't think that we can predict or know what is going to happen. I do think that we are in a time of enormous transition, and it's kind of like a liminal time, like a birth canal, like there's something being born. And I love that quote, I don't know if you're familiar with it, by Joanna Macy, where she talks about us being on the razor's edge, and we don't know like which way it's going to go, and all we can do is kind of most creatively devote ourselves to making it turn out the way that we want it to turn out. But we don't really know how it's going to go.
And I guess I would have to agree with you. I know of very little literature where you can look forward and make predictions based on astrology. In fact, I know there have been some scientific studies to test that, and they had null results. On the other hand, in my own case, working with my mentor, who I was telling you about, Arthur M. Young, who is both an inventor of the helicopter of all things, and an astrologer, and he saw some interesting relationships between the two. But he at one time asked me, because my life has been largely based on, I guess I would call them synchronicities, or as if the universe was reaching out to push me in different directions through dreams, very specific dreams, which is why I'm here speaking to you today. And he would ask me, well, when did this occur? And what were the main synchronicities of your life? And he found, for example, that when the Arabian part of coincidence, which, if I recall correctly, has to do with the planet Uranus, in a particular angular relationship, when it crosses this point where Uranus was on my birth chart, that's when these synchronicities have occurred, very specifically separated by years. And I think you point out that you don't know how it works, but it does work. And I've had the same experience.
Yes. And Uranus is very much related with the unexpected and downloads and something that is out of the blue and different than just your regular day-to-day experience.
Arthur Young had some similarities in his own chart with mine, and he had the same experience with coincidences. So he was alert to look for that in my chart and found the same thing. So
right. Well, it's also interesting, like he looked at your chart for that because that was something that was important in his chart. And I mean, astrology is so vast, and we look at like what's interesting to us,
Yeah. Well, I'm under the impression, looking through your book, that after this awakening that occurred at the age of 49, you opened yourself up to the widest variety of alternative, I think you call it multi-modality treatment, but it almost read like a catalog of New Age remedies.
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, I practice most of the things that I mentioned, or really all of the things that I mentioned in that chapter, and I recommend them routinely to my patients, and I find them very helpful, and I feel like it helps people, especially during this time on our planet when there's so much fear and uncertainty, to feel connected to something larger than themselves and feel in communion with the universe. And so they're very important.
I know that in addition to considering yourself an astrologer, you also refer to yourself as a shaman. And I'm sure many of our viewers are curious about that beautiful portrait behind you of the white lion. And I know you begin your book with a story of the white lions of Timbavati.
Right, in South Africa. Well, at that time, I was studying with Maurice Fernandez, an astrologer, and he had a connection with the white lions of Timbavati and Linda Tucker, who is the person who has the conservation land where she cares for them. And so we traveled there, and the white lions, there's a Shangan myth, an African myth about these white lions, and they're a genetic anomaly. They only began to appear on Earth in our memory in the 30s, and then I think there weren't more born, and then more recently, I don't know when exactly, more of the white lions started being born. And the myth is that they originally came to Earth, they're star beings, and they came to Earth during the Ice Age to teach the people to hunt and to survive. And they said that they, once the danger had passed, that they left again and said that they would only return when, if needed, when people were in danger again. And now we are in danger, and they have begun to be born again, and coincides with the threat to our ecosystem and the biosphere.
I'm not sure that our viewers are entirely aware of how serious the threat is, because it's like, we're the frog in the boiling water, that it becomes normal after a while, that all the political chaos and acrimony, for example, becomes normalized, and the idea that there are more and more forest fires and more droughts and more extreme weather everywhere becomes normalized, to the extent that we don't appreciate that we're living in a very dangerous time as well as a very promising time.
Right. I'm in complete agreement with you. And I mean, it just, unfortunately, just like with the pharmaceutical industry, the fossil fuel industry is very powerful. And I mean, it's very difficult to understand, like, what the thinking is that how are they going to live on the planet? If with all the money that they make from fossil fuels and preventing alternative resources of energy, like what's the idea that for them, that they're going to be able to live on the planet when it's destroyed this way? I don't know.
It does seem short-sighted, to put it mildly, but I gather that as a psychiatrist, you have to be appreciative of the fact that we are all living in extreme circumstances, and that affects the whole field of psychiatry, that to be a so-called normal person in an abnormal world is abnormal in and of itself.
Right. Well, Gabor Mate wrote that book, The Myth of Normal. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I mean, what's normal in our culture is to be looking at the screen all day and to barely have any contact with nature, to eat a diet that is not healthful, that often contains many harmful processed foods. It's normal to just not have any kind of connection with the sky or the universe or with spiritual practice, to be completely without a connection to something larger than the self. That's normal.
Well,
and it's a prescription for alienation and depression and anxiety.
When you say something larger than the self, I think you're referring to the ego, really.
Right. Well, yes, the small self, the personality self, the body, like we have a way of accessing connection that can create a feeling of expansion and uplift, but it needs to be consciously practiced. Like, it just doesn't happen if you live like a normal life and just focus upon, making money and drinking and whatever that is very common and typical for the average person.
It seems to me the physical world into which we're born is extremely seductive. It's very, very easy to forget that we have a soul at all. And I don't even think, for the most part, that conventional religions emphasize the soul particularly, not in this country.
No, not really. I think you're right. And when patients come to see me, and I ask them about their spiritual practice, they very often say that they don't have one, but they would really like to have one. But they don't know how to go about it because they don't have any templates or any models of how to connect. And so that's often something that we talk about, and which makes a pretty big difference for people. I think it's a big, big part of healing.
One of the practices that you recommend, for example, is the creation of an altar in one's own home.
Right. And it doesn't need to be like a dedicated room or any kind of big space. It's just like a little corner where you put down a beautiful cloth or have a vase with a flower or some rocks that are meaningful to you or shells. Just something that reminds you that feeds your soul. Something that reminds you that you are more than just your physical body going through the daily grind of your day.
Another aspect of your practice that I think focuses on a very important and often overlooked area in medicine is chronic diseases.
Yes. And the chronic diseases are actually very common. Like, I write about 3 of them. One of them that is really, I would say, the most common is mast cell activation syndrome. And that can be the result of many different kinds of conditions. It can result because of mold exposure in the environment. It can result because of chronic Lyme disease. I think that long COVID is often related. Mast cell activation is related to long COVID. It can result because of trauma, a car accident, or any other kind of trauma. But mast cells are white cells that are part of the immune system. And when they behave in a dysregulated fashion, they release bioactive substances that can cause anxiety and depression and inflammation in the body and all manner of different symptoms affecting different organ systems. And when a conventional physician is not aware of mast cell activation and they see a patient who has symptoms related to multiple different organ systems, they cannot diagnose anything that makes sense according to their paradigm. They'll refer a person to a psychiatrist. And if a psychiatrist is not aware of that this is a condition related to mast cell activation, they'll say, okay, you're depressed. Let's start an antidepressant, or let's start an anti-anxiety medicine. And these medicines, that's it's harm because, first of all, they're not addressing the underlying cause that could be treated. And second of all, those medicines, people have a very hard time getting off of them. There's tremendous withdrawal syndromes with many of the conventionally prescribed pharmaceuticals, and there's not sufficient warning given to the patient about this. And you really need to wean a person skillfully and support them in different ways in order to successfully get them off of them. So not only are they not getting treated for the real thing that's going on, but then they're getting put on a medicine that they are not going to have an easy time stopping.
So you recommend, I gather, lifestyle changes for these people?
Well, very much so. Nutrition is a foundation of my practice, and I recommend an anti-inflammatory diet. And some people have food intolerances that they're not aware of. And if they were to eliminate gluten or dairy or eggs or soy or nuts or seeds or nightshades, for each person it may be something different. If they can identify what it is that is triggering them, many of their chronic health conditions would disappear, but that is not something that most conventional physicians pay much attention to. I'm astonished when a person comes in with serious irritable bowel syndrome that they've been told that the diet is not important. I don't know how it's really astonishing, honestly. But not only nutrition, but there's many people are in a state of chronic hyperarousal. They're in a chronic state of fight or flight because of poor diet, because of the news cycle, because of all of the trauma of what's going on in the world now, or what happened in childhood. They're in a chronic state of fight or flight, and that very much contributes to chronic inflammation. And so there are a variety of programs that a person can work with in order to calm down their autonomic nervous system and retrain their brain, and specifically the limbic system of their brain, which is related to trauma. And then they will feel much calmer. And it's very, very, very supportive for healing.
I guess part of the problem is that the conditions that you describe, this sort of out of touch with your own soul, is endemic amongst medical doctors themselves.
Totally. The suicide rate amongst doctors is one of the highest. And it's, medicine is, the way it's practiced today conventionally is not very satisfying. There's tremendous demand to document and to interact with the medical record. There's very little time to connect with the patient. Very often, a patient won't see the same provider. They'll see the nurse practitioner, or they'll see the physician assistant. There's not a relationship. And doctors went into medicine, most of them, because they had some desire to be a healer, and that's not what's happening. And then they're burdened with incredible debt from medical education, and they feel really trapped.
I recall visiting one doctor who didn't even look at me during the brief interview that he had. He was always focusing on his own computer while we were talking.
Yeah, I think that's like not uncommon. And it's sad. There was an article recently written in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very prestigious medical journal. And it was called something like A Calling or a Cog in the Capitalist Machine. Because a lot of medical practices have now been taken over by corporations, and the article was talking about how residents were like incredibly resentful about being told that if they protested like being exploited, that they were not like being true to their calling. So it was like a way of making the residents guilty that they weren't being treated as though they were exercising a calling. They were being exploited to make money for a corporation. Like when I was in training, it was so different than it is today. Like there was such an investment in cultivating me as like the best psychiatrist. And there was a lot of where I trained, there was a lot of emphasis on becoming the best therapist possible. And there was no limit on how often I could see a patient. It was as often as I wanted to. There was a pool for free care, and now everything is like insurance based, and a resident has to stop seeing a patient because the insurance doesn't cover it. They can't afford the copay. It's very, very, very different. And like there was such a investment in us. And what I see now going on at the hospital is that the residents feel very abandoned and unprotected. So it's sad.
And I gather that when you're in residency, sometimes you have to do a 36 or a 48-hour shift without sleep.
Yeah, I don't know what the rules are now. I think some of that has changed somewhat. But, they like at the hospital where I still teach and supervise, there's been a lot of safety issues, and the residents feel very unprotected. The person who I'm supervising is in a state of fear before she goes on call because you don't know what's going to happen. And there's been patients with loaded guns, and they won't put up metal detectors, and it's a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Well, I can tell you from my perspective, and I know that you have been watching New Thinking Aloud, so you're aware that of my interest in parapsychology, not just interest, but really profession. One of the things I run into all the time with people who are having psychic experiences, which actually is about 70% of the population, they're afraid to talk about it because people will think they're crazy.
100%. There's a wonderful book that's called Extraordinary Knowing by a psychoanalyst named Liz B. Mayer, who no longer is alive. She died very young. But she described in her book all of these really extraordinary paranormal experiences that therapists and psychoanalysts had, and they were afraid to share them with anyone for fear of being thought crazy.
I gather you, fortunately, have overcome that fear.
Yes, and in fact, people come to see me because they have some hope and faith that if they tell me certain things that I'm not going to think that they're crazy and that I'll be interested.
Among other things that you recommend for your clients is to pay attention to tarot cards.
Yes, I love the tarot cards. I love the oracle decks. It's like the universe is talking to you. I use them daily. It's the more you use them, the more you get messages and are able to sort of dialogue with them. And I I sometimes use them in my practice if a patient is interested, but I use them personally, like all the time. And like and one thing that I'm doing now in my practice that is relatively new is ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and I do it in this ceremonial and sacred way. And before we begin the journey, we always pick an oracle card, and it very often is very relevant to the journey that the person has and is very meaningful, deeply meaningful.
Let's talk about ketamine. I've had it. I love it. I loved it. I've only had it once, but it was amazing.
A lozenge or IV or?
IV.
IV.
I did. I had ketamine as an IV. Must have been about 30 years ago. I still remember the experience very clearly. But I guess that even amongst our viewers who are familiar with psychedelics, ayahuasca, DMT, psilocybin are very popular these days. People don't know that much about ketamine.
Right. Well, ketamine is the only psychedelic that's legal in Massachusetts. So it's the only one that I can work with in my practice. And it's like the way that I do it in my practice, it's ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, or CAP, K-A-P. And it's low-dose ketamine, like versus the IV, which is more high-dose. So it's lozenges, and like ketamine has been around forever. It's a dissociative anesthetic. It's on the list of the World Health Organization's most important medications because it's so useful and so safe, has such a high margin of safety. And it was like a buddy drug in Vietnam, like soldiers would carry it in case their comrades were wounded. It's used a lot in pediatric anesthesiology. So when I use it in my practice, let's say a person has intractable depression. It can be very useful for that. It can be very useful for addiction. It can be very useful for chronic anxiety, for kind of rumination. And the way that I do it is that I have a lozenge compounded by a compounding pharmacy. And then the session itself is about 3 hours long. And the person comes and we do a ceremony. That's when I kind of do my most shamanic thing in my practice. I call in the directions, I call in the ancestors and guides, and we put on beautiful music, and they put on an eye shade and lie down on the couch and take the lozenge, and then we talk. Like depending, some people don't like to talk as much, but some people love to talk. And I take notes about what we talk about. And then we, and very often there's like a big feeling of heart opening with the ketamine. And like for some patients, they connect with ancestors. And it really is mood elevating for many patients. Like they really feel better afterwards. And like one patient that I have, like she says that, she's somebody who, she didn't have like a diagnosable depression or anxiety disorder. She says that now she's just not sweating the small stuff, like that it has somehow allowed her to let go in a way and to have more perspective. So we do 6 sessions in optimally once a week for 6 weeks in a row, with an integration session in between where we come in and talk about what went on during the session and how to understand it. And it's been a very wonderful addition to my practice. And it's a tool, like, because I don't really like to prescribe medications to patients unless I'm prescribing them in order to wean them from medications. It allows me to work with people that otherwise I would not be able to work with, because like it's a lot of work to see a holistic psychiatrist, like it's a lot of work to change your diet. It's a lot of work to do one of these limbic system retraining practices. And if a person is like super depressed, they don't have the motivation to follow through on all of the things that I want them to do. So sometimes ketamine can help shift that, that they can become less depressed and more capable.
As I recall from my experience long ago, you completely forget about your body. In fact, you can go so deep within that you don't even know particularly who you are or what a body is. But then at that point, you have complete mental freedom. You can go anywhere. And I remember being at the time I lived in California, I was a California person. I decided to feel what it was like to become a redwood tree. And in my mind, I became a redwood tree. And then I thought, I wonder what it's like to be a whale. And I became a whale. And it reminds me of what parapsychologists call remote viewing. We know in the laboratory, people are capable of reaching out and fetching information from different points in time and space. In the near-death experience, they call it learning by identification. You become that which you try to investigate. And that's what seemed to happen to me under the influence of ketamine.
Were you doing it for psychospiritual growth and exploration? Was that your motivation for doing it?
I've been using psychedelics since I was in my early 20s, nearly half a century. And I'm fortunate in the sense that I was always inspired by that motive. It was never just a question of partying.
Yes, not a question of partying and not a question of treating like some kind of psychiatric symptom that you were suffering with.
I've been blessed not to, in my adult life, have to experience those symptoms. When I was a teenager, I think I had a lot of anxiety and some depression, which is, I guess, common to teenagers anyway. But I outgrew it once I reached my 20s, and I do regard it as a blessing. So my use of psychedelics was always really for personal growth. And I have to say, that was the result. I think I benefited enormously from it. And I'm aware not everybody does.
Yes, but many do. And it's really the new frontier in psychiatry. I mean, it has so much potential for treating trauma. Like the existing therapies are really not very effective, and they've existed for a really long time. Like Prozac came out, and when I was a resident, it was like 1987, I think, or 8, and not much has progressed since then, until the psychedelics. And it's very promising that probably in this coming year that more of them will be legalized for psychotherapeutic use at least.
Well, I know in Oregon and in Colorado, psilocybin is being decriminalized, and those states are even starting to certify guides for people to go through psilocybin experiences. And as I recall, there was a study at Johns Hopkins University with psilocybin, and the patients reported having the most powerful spiritual experiences of their lives.
100%. It's very helpful for people who have fear about death and dying. Very helpful for healing trauma.
But I have to say that it does bring up what for me is a paradox, and that is that when you see how psilocybin, a chemical, can influence the brain to create these very powerful spiritual experiences, it might lead one to take a physicalist interpretation. That's what we're made up of is molecules. It's all molecular activity. And yet it seems to be pointing to a very different world, a world in which consciousness itself is primary, not molecules.
Right. And that it's somehow it enables access to that world in a way that when a person is not having those medicines, that they are cut off from it, or don't have access with that kind of intent and result.
I'm under the impression that what psychedelics may do is actually prevent the brain from blocking our higher consciousness, our larger spiritual self, which normally I think the brain filters out, because if you're always in a state of samadhi, it's harder to go to work every day and support your family.
Right. Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, one thing that I know about ketamine, and I imagine it's true for the other psychedelics as well, that it impacts the default mode network, which is this area of the brain that makes us think about things in usual and repetitive ways. So that it interrupts that. And that can be so helpful for people who ruminate and who kind of go over the same things again and again. Like it allows, like it was described when I did the training as miracle grow for the brain, just like allowing a lot of new neuronal connections.
Well, I have to ask you how your colleagues at Harvard and the Boston community respond to your interests. I know other psychiatrists like John Mack got into a lot of trouble.
He was one of my supervisors, my first supervisors. We had so much fun together. No, like I'm ignored, basically. I tried to offer, like, giving a talk at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute. They have a program, Meet the Author, and they just don't answer my emails. And I do teach and supervise at the Cambridge Health Alliance still, but they're not like, I mean, and when I do a consultation, I don't talk about the patient's astrology. You know, like I kind of leave a part of myself at home. I use my psychoanalytic training which is what they're inviting me for.
Yeah.
So I don't feel as though it's in any kind of way integrated, and I don't feel as though I'm in any kind of way a significant player anywhere in that world.
And I suppose John Mack got into a lot of trouble after he had a #1 best-selling book out.
The whole issue of extraterrestrial, like championing that as like a reality was just, I mean, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, right? I think for Lawrence of Arabia,
Yes.
But I don't think they were successful at taking away his. I don't know if they did expel him from.
No, they did not, but they raised a storm about it. He had to hire a lawyer. In fact, I've interviewed Daniel Sheehan, who was his lawyer at the time.
Yeah, no, he was a wonderful person.
While he was your supervisor, I imagine you were exposed to his interest in these UFO abduction cases.
Absolutely. We had a grand rounds where he, played recordings of the interviews with patients under hypnosis who related what had happened to them. And there was another very famous psychiatrist who was my residency director. His name was Leston Havens, and he was a brilliant, amazing psychiatrist. And I said to him afterwards, I said, "So, Les, like, what do you think?" And he kind of smiled at me and he said, "That was John at his most miraculous." So, I think Les didn't buy it, Yeah. And there's, I mean, people are constantly doubting the veracity of any kind of material that's obtained under hypnosis,
I understand that. I practiced hypnosis myself, and I realize that there are all sorts of ways in which the hypnotist can influence, I think, even telepathically, the person under hypnosis. But many of the UFO accounts do not depend upon hypnosis either.
Right, but in his presentation, that's what he was sharing with us. I had a child patient that I was seeing at that time. I was in training. He was my child supervisor, and I forget the reason why, but he interviewed her, and she referred to him as Big Mack.
I did know John myself. I've interviewed him many years ago, and I've interviewed Ralph Blumenthal, who's written the biography now of John Mack. I think we still have a lot to learn about UFO phenomena. Now we have congressional hearings and the like. And the Navy is admitting that these objects are being tracked on radar, and the Navy has released video, and more is being released all the time. I think of it as another new frontier, and I would think with your interest in astronomy and astrology that UFOs would also be something that would come up in your work.
Well, it hasn't come up with my patients. There's a astrological configuration that's going to take place on April 20th, which is a conjunction between, conjunction means two planets coming together, between Uranus and Jupiter. And again, Uranus, this outside of the box. And everybody kind of speculates, like, what is this going to mean? Like something big outside the box is potentially going to take place. And I've wondered if it will be something about UFOs and some kind of more revealed about extraterrestrial contact. What's your take on it, Jeff? What's your position about it?
Well, I did a 10-year study. It began when I was still a graduate student in 1976 and ran until the individual died in 1987. His name was Ted Owens, and he claimed to be in telepathic contact with UFOs, and he claimed that they had gifted him with various powers of psychokinesis or mind over matter. Uri Geller, another psychokinetic person of renown, also made a similar claim. And Ted Owens demonstrated this in experiments that I set up with him. He said he could produce UFOs in dramatic ways. He said, I'll create a UFO for you that will be seen by hundreds of people. It will be photographed, and the photograph will be published on the front page of one of your local newspapers. That happened just days later. So I'm convinced personally that something's going on. Something very real is going on. I don't claim to have an answer as to what it is. It might be, as with most medical conditions that you deal with, it has multiple causes, many things sort of acting together. But there's no doubt in my mind that things that seem so bizarre as to be unbelievable actually do occur. And most people have what I call a boggle threshold. And if it goes beyond their boggle threshold, they dismiss it. And we all have.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like that, and that's what's kind of mind blowing, like the pyramids or the crop circles or just things that can't be explained. These temples or Neolithic structures set up in Ireland all over the place. Like, we don't understand how these things could have happened. And yet it's just sort of ignored. Like, well, what does that mean? So it's just, when I was in college, I'm sure you know this book, like one of my favorite books that we ever read was I was a philosophy major. It was the Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution.
A classic.
Talked about like a suitcase, like our theories are like a suitcase. Our paradigms are like a suitcase. And it's a good paradigm if like everything fits in the suitcase. But the more other things like don't fit anymore, so the belt is hanging out or the sleeve of the shirt is hanging out, you need to like change the paradigm. Like it doesn't hold it anymore. But we just ignore that these things are all sticking out of the suitcase.
And I think that we're at a point now where all of these anomalies, as I recall Kuhn referred to them, unexplained things, they're piling up, they're adding up, and people know the current paradigms of materialism and physicalism and allopathic medicine have their limitations. They're not capable of explaining these phenomena. The biggest anomaly, of course, is consciousness itself. The very fact that you and I have experiences is not accountable in materialistic science, but we don't yet have a better answer. The best interpretation I know of comes from the philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, who says consciousness is primary, not matter.
Yeah, I buy that.
Well, Judy Suzanne, what a pleasure to talk to you. I'm so glad that we connected. This has been a delightful conversation, and I can't tell you how many of our viewers on this channel are people who are having paranormal experiences. They often need psychiatric help, and they don't know where to go, and they're afraid of being labeled as crazy because they may have problems.
They would be.
Yeah.
They would be labeled as crazy.
And people do have real problems. You yourself have described some very real problems in your own upbringing, but that doesn't make you crazy.
Right. 100%. Thank you, Jeff, for having me. Thank you so much. You're so gracious. You're an amazing host, conversationalist, just very, very kind, very, very, engaging, present. Big fan, Jeff.
Thank you for being with me. It's truly been a joy. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. I imagine that by now, many of you already realize that in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.